right. Well, it's an honor and a privilege to introduce Scott Slovic to you today. Scott is undoubtedly the most familiar face in the field known as ecocriticism, which is the study of literature and the environment, as essentially because he's the primary force behind creating the field. Going back a number of years to the 1990s, he was the founding president of the Association for the Study of Literature and the Environment, the acronym ASLE, which is a major international organization today that has an extraordinarily large conference every 2 years with scholars increasingly coming from all around the world to participate in this discussion about literature and the environment that he helped to begin. And it's also important to recognize Scott's, Scott is an extraordinarily prolific scholar. He's published over 300 articles and edited, co-edited, or authored over 25 books. And so he's certainly well known on the printed page, but one of the things that he adds to that extraordinarily prolific energy as a scholar is a kind of zeal for the field as an ambassador for it, and today's lecture is an example of that. He's traveled all over the world to help people make the connection between the study of the humanities and environmental values. And this is I know that's part of what we are going to hear about today. He's been a Fulbright scholar in Germany and Japan and China, and he's been a visiting professor at many other universities throughout the world. And it's extraordinary to me in my travels in Latin America and other places. As soon as I start talking about literature and the environment, everyone knows who Scott Slovic is. So he's been an extraordinary, I'm going to just call it a missionary for the cause, given Brigham Young University as a context here. And I'll just say on a personal anecdote, and I'm one of the many people, there are people who get involved in the environmental humanities often have conversion stories where they sort of had the light turned on, where they recognized this vital connection between the study of the humanities and environmental concern, and that happened. Scott was actually very early on in this whole process. It was in early mid 90s. I think it was probably about 95 or 96. I was teaching at Northern Arizona University, and there was a workshop that was going to help professors incorporate principles of sustainability into their classes. And I was a humanities professor, and I was extremely skeptical, but they were offering a $1,000 stipend to participate. So I quickly signed up, and I didn't care what it was. I was going to do it for $1,000. And Scott was one of the presenters, and it changed my career. It certainly got me going just in the short term, thinking about a couple of classes I was teaching. But many people attribute their interest in this field to his energy. So it's really an honor. I should just say, by way of sort of formal explanation, he is a professor of English at the University of Idaho. He's been there since 2012. He taught at University of Nevada, Reno for 17 years prior to that, and that's where he and a cohort of faculty created the first ever PhD program in literature and the environment. And meanwhile, he just told me just now he's about to complete his 25th year as the editor of the official journal of ASLE, which is called ISLE, Interdisciplinary Study of Literature and the Environment. So that's another reason why his name is everywhere, and he's mentored many scholars over the course of those years and helped to shape the direction of the field. And his big push of late, well, not even of late, I think always from the beginning, was internationalizing the movement. And so it's a real pleasure to have him here. And I will just say on a personal note, Scott is a very unassuming guy, even though I just presented you with lots of reasons why he could be a real arrogant person, and he's not. He's a really genuine, unassuming, and very, very decent and wonderful person, and it's a personal pleasure to welcome him here to BYU, so thank you.
Thank you so much, George, and thank you, Stan, for your help in coordinating this visit. Thanks to all of you for being here today. I hadn't really thought of myself as a missionary per se, but that's exactly the kind of enthusiasm that I bring to the work that I've been doing for so many years, which probably dates back well before I was conscious of myself as a scholar or as someone working in the environmental arena. But I don't want to sidetrack myself because I have to be extremely efficient to let you get onto your next appointments and classes and things like that. And Stan in the front row here is going to signal me with about 10 minutes to go so that I can make sure to wrap things up and send you on your way. When I started my career, people used to call me the Johnny Appleseed of nature writing. That's when we were talking about nature writing rather than ecocriticism and the environmental humanities, which is where we, the kind of phrasing that we use today. But I'm still a bit of a Johnny Appleseed, and I want to tell you some stories from that. I wish we had a little more time so that I could sketch more examples from around the world. As George just said, I do work in many different far corners of the world, familiar and unfamiliar. And even when I'm not traveling there in person, I'm receiving emails from Kurdistan or from Tehran or not yet from North Korea, but still from some pretty strange parts of the world. There's still time, this may happen, but I often attempting to support the kind of work that I know we all need to be thinking about because we inhabit the planet together. So the first slide just shows me sitting with a group of graduate students from eastern Morocco, the city of Oujda on the border of Algeria. And this was a couple summers ago. In addition to giving a presentation like this, often I will try to build more time into my schedule so that I can hear what other people are working on. I try to do as much listening as I do speaking, and then I gather this information and I give talks like this one, sharing this with other people. So George mentioned the word ecocriticism, which is a bit of jargon describing environmentally oriented or ecological literary studies or cultural studies or textual studies more broadly. The term comes from 1978 when it was used in the title of an article by William Ruckert. He didn't really go into detail about what this type of study might be in that article, but the term stuck and was reused a number of years later in 1996 when Cheryl Glotfelty and Harold Fromm published a book. Again, the term comes from 1978, but it didn't really resurface and become put to use until 1996 when it was the title of this book by Glotfelty and Fromm. And Cheryl Glotfelty's definition at the time was that ecocriticism was the study of the relationship between literature and the physical world, as opposed to focusing on the human realm and human relationships. What about that world out there beyond the human? And this kind of came as a wild idea to a lot of people that actually there is a world out there and maybe literature has something to do with it. One of my own favorite definitions of ecocriticism is from David Maisel, who, and I'm not seeing the slides on the screen here as I thought I would, so I'm going to have to turn around and look. David Maisel in 2000 said that ecocriticism is the study of literature as if the earth mattered. And often I use this phrase when I'm visiting with people who are blinking their eyes at the concept of ecocriticism and saying, well, what is this strange idea? Well, do you think that it's important that we inhabit a place and that we try to maintain it so that we can continue living here and share it with other species? Well, of course the earth matters, so maybe all of us, regardless of what branch of the humanities we're working in, ought to be keeping the environment in mind in some way or another. I tend to use a very broad definition. I look at cultural texts primarily in my work, not just literature these days, but a variety of other kinds of texts. And You can look at any kind of text, even if the environment is never mentioned, nothing about nature is mentioned, and you can find an environmental way of reading that text, as far as I'm concerned. On the other hand, you can take any sort of hermeneutic or analytical approach to texts that are explicitly about the environment. So there are certain texts that foreground the natural world or the human, non-human relationship, but you can take a psychoanalytic approach or a gendered approach or a Marxist materialist approach. It doesn't matter if you're studying that kind of text. I would regard that as a type of eco-criticism. I have what some people call an open door policy with regard to eco-criticism, and I find that's a way to welcome people into this field and support the kind of work that they're doing. There are many, many, many Americans, people in North America, or including Canada and Mexico, doing this kind of work. I'm really not going to focus on that in my remarks today, because in the blurb about the talk, I said I was going to focus on Spanish language, Chinese, and India. And so that's really where the heart of my lecture will be. But these are some household names in the field of eco-criticism, and I wish I had time to delve into some of the key ideas that their work represents, especially things like slow violence. Everywhere I look nowadays in the field of the environmental humanities, I see people referring to Rob Nixon's phrase, slow violence. How do we conceptualize the kinds of things that are happening on Earth these days that exceed our apprehension? That's his word. We have difficulty grasping them conceptually and through our senses. And that may be a tragic flaw in human nature, that we've created a planet that we can no longer quite understand. And that may lead us to fail to grasp what's happening in time to intervene and perhaps forestall some changes that are not positive. So back in 2010, my colleagues Swarnalata Rangaranjan and Vidya Sarveswaran from India came up to me at a conference in Taiwan and said, we're thinking of starting a project called Ecocriticism of the Global South. We would like to try to gather the voices from parts of the world, especially the developing world, that we haven't been hearing, and learn how they would approach this field of eco-criticism and what their unique cultural perspectives might be. And so in 2010, we began to search around and contact people and try to put together what we thought of as a single book of, that we would call Ecocriticism of the Global South. But soon we found that there were so many interesting voices that we couldn't fit them all into a single volume. And in 2014 and 2015, we published 2 different books, and we continue to do this kind of work in other parts of the world, realizing, as I said earlier, that the environment matters, the earth matters to people no matter where they're living in the world. They have their own strategies and traditions for reading cultural texts. Why not try to bring those voices to the rest of the world? And a little bit later, I'll explain what some of the issues are with regard to a predominantly North American and European approach. And in fact, when I hear from people in other parts of the world, or when I visit them, and they start reciting to me the names of prominent thinkers from the West, especially from the United States, I say I'm impressed with their ability to gather all of this information, often in places where it's not easy to find Western scholarly works. But I also say, what kind of local traditions do you have? Ways of looking at the world that might give you a unique inflection, a unique angle of insight. For instance, when I heard from a graduate student in Erbil, Kurdistan, a few years ago in an email, he immediately began telling me about the Western scholars that he wanted to use in his dissertation. And I said, this is interesting. However, maybe you have something to contribute based on your own cultural background. And he began reflecting on that and talking with his advisor, and they realized that Zoroastrian theology was very important in that part of the world, and they might be able to develop a kind of Zoroastrian eco-criticism. And that was a couple years ago, and I haven't heard from them since. So maybe it was a dead end, and they just thought that they didn't have anything to report back to me. On the other hand, that's my impulse, to try to elicit these other perspectives when possible. So I'm primarily going to talk, as I said earlier, about China, Taiwan, India, and Latin America, Spain, and Cuba today. But I'm interested in the vernacular, in a unique approach, something with a kind of distinctive local quality to it. And I once did a sabbatical, spent half a year in Brisbane, Australia. I've been thinking a lot about Australia lately today, as I suspect many of you have been, because it's in all the headlines, and it's a place of tremendous interest and concern for all of us who pay attention to the environment. Australia is one of the epicenters of ecocriticism, has been for many years. And one of the interesting things about Australian ecocriticism is that, well, Australia has a very powerful physical presence. If any of you have ever spent time there, you know that it's a beautiful and a kind of harsh environment. Much of the country is sparsely inhabited. It's the red center. Extremely dry, very small communities, mining communities, tourist communities, Aboriginal communities in the center. The bulk of the Australian population is huddled in cities like Melbourne, Sydney, and Brisbane on the eastern coast, and then a few places like Darwin and Perth and other areas, but they're huddled together. The national motto is "Stay between the flags" when you go to the beach. Right? You all stay together. You don't wander away. You don't go into the water, because who knows what's out there? Jellyfish, sharks. You stay together at where the lifeguards are. So there's a strong sense that the physical place influences the way we think about ourselves, our safety, our ability to thrive in an environment, and also our vulnerability. And so what I find in many of the Australian ecocritics is this sense of what I call geographical determinism. And one of the best examples of that is this person on the lower left, Mark Tredinnick, who did a large PhD thesis about 15 years ago and then promptly transformed himself into a poet. And now he's basically a freelance poet trying to make a living. He's one of the premier poets now in Australia, and he pieces together a living. He doesn't do ecocriticism, but his book, his PhD thesis, which became the book, The Land's Wild Music, the thesis focused on Australian and American writers, but he published a book in the United States just zeroing in on American writers, emphasizing the fact that places imply a kind of language or an artistic voice, and human expression, by which he describes as music, implies place, that the two are inseparable from each other for Tredinnick. And then he proceeds in his book, after theorizing about this for a while, to discuss various writers, such as Barry Lopez, from the Pacific Northwest, lives in the dense green forests of the Willamette Valley, and he writes in great detail about how the wet woods of the Western Cascades change the very language, or affect the very language of Barry Lopez's work. As he says here, his paragraphs look dense, forbidding at first, yet the light in his paragraphs, as in the forests, is as archetypal as a dream. And on and on. He writes about Lopez's literary language as if it carries the physical place in its very structure and tone and mood and many other dimensions. So this is an example of geographical determinism, an important kind of Australian ecocriticism. In his book, Tredinnick also writes about Peter Matheson from Long Island, New York, Terry Tempest Williams, who grew up in this area, and writes about the desert, and he writes about how the desert influences her voice, and James Galvin from Wyoming and Colorado, and the Rocky Mountain sensibility that he expresses in his work. Lately, Tredinnick I was just looking him up a few days ago on his website. He's been writing, of course, about fire, and he uses this powerful phrase. This is just something that must have occurred to him in a burst. Here we stand on the leading edge of a climate catastrophe, still hoping, against all the ashen evidence, it's a suburb. This is what many people in Australian suburban communities must be thinking. They're still hoping that their homes exist as typical suburbs, much like North American suburbs, much like areas in Provo, and yet now all they are is ashes, evidence of what's happening worldwide, but of which Australia is becoming a primary cautionary example. This is a particularly eerie photo that I pulled off the internet with a flaming building and a kangaroo hopping past it. This is what I think of with, and it's also another example of geographical determinism, the way our physical environment is changing and how that may change our voice in our writing and other forms of expression. Also, very briefly, a few other interesting vernacular approaches from Anglophone regions of the world, such as South Africa and Malaysia, or Southern Africa, because it includes Zimbabwe. One of the leading South African writers who teaches at Rhodes University, I'll talk about him in a minute, actually is Zimbabwean, but has lived in South Africa for some time. So I attended a meeting in the Cape Town area, Hudgedacht is the name of the area, on the ecology of Southern Africa some years ago. A number of the leading South African ecocritics, Helen Tiffin and Wendy Woodward and Julia Martin and others are in this photo. But some of the important approaches in Southern African literature is to think about post-colonial ecologies. How does the experience of an area of the world that has native cultures, native ecosystems, how does that respond to the presence, often the long presence over centuries of non-native human cultures, the colonial process? And this might be a good time to just say briefly that you have a number of leading scholars here at BYU in the environmental humanities, ecocriticism per se, and more specifically in post-colonial ecocriticism, like George Handley, who introduced me, is one of the preeminent scholars of post-colonial ecocritical studies, which is becoming, it's long been an important facet of ecocriticism, but it certainly applies to places like South Africa, and many of the scholars in that part of the country are doing their own work on the post-colonial experience. Another important dimension is the idea of the animals and our relationships with animals, domesticated animals and wild animals. And one of the leading scholars of this work is Wendy Woodward, who came from the field of critical animal studies and moved into the neighboring field of ecocriticism. And so she published this book, The Animal Gaze, Animal Subjectivities in Southern African Narratives, a number of years ago, thinking about not just our gaze, our viewing and controlling of animals, but the way they look back at us, and how human literature might represent the animal gaze in a way that makes us more sensitive to the subjective agency, the power, and the identity of animals, instead of simply thinking of animals, non-human animals, as a kind of inert matter that humans act upon. So that's Wendy Woodward's major contribution to this field. She's the one on the left in this photo. Now Dan Wiley, and I think I need to speed up and move through this quickly. Dan Wiley wrote this really fascinating article published in the South African Journal of Literary Studies in 2007, where he tries to imagine the perspective of the other, of a highly, deeply non-Western culture, by thinking of the native people of that part of the world, the Bushmen, and their view of non-human animals, not as fundamentally separate from the human, but as kindred, literally as brothers and sisters. And this is not a manufactured, kind of imagined idea for the Bushmen. This is the way they live their daily lives with all of their brothers and sisters, who may be snakes and birds and other kinds of creatures. So Dan Wiley attempts to imagine the meaning of the environment for Bushmen and then to articulate this or to translate it into terms that we, people like us, might be able to comprehend. And it's very interesting to me that he says in this article, I'm uncomfortable with the term ecocriticism to the extent that it implies a cohesive school of thought. He sees little such cohesion, and in fact, he's attempting to find a deeply unique and distinctive vernacular mode or local mode. Vernacular means local mode of ecocriticism that is completely different than any sort of mainstream international approach to the field. And what I particularly love about Wiley's approach is how it reinforces the notion that these vernaculars exist. And if we might have to struggle to capture them, and we might, in fact, even misrepresent them because it's so difficult to know the point of view of the other. Nonetheless, it's a worthwhile exercise. And that's what he tries to do. He says, perhaps nowhere do we sense the essence of the Bushman view of human-natural relations that in those stories dealing with a primordial time when animals were people and spoke the same languages. This is Dan Wiley with a cat right here. But he's attempting to basically imagine this other way of thinking about the non-human, highly different than a Western perspective. Julia Martin, one of the preeminent scholars of the poet Gary Snyder's work, is a South African scholar, but she also is a creative nonfiction writer and writes about her complicated and ambivalent life as a person of English descent whose family has always lived in South Africa. So she's attempting to walk a fine line in various memoirs that she's written of being receptive to the native culture and at the same time to understand her own existence as a post-colonial inhabitant of South Africa. Malaysia is a multicultural former British colony in Southeast Asia. There's a very strong native Malaysian population, Chinese and Indian populations, and they're attempting to corral and gather their sense of what Malaysian environmental literature might be. So this is, I'm referring here on the right to an article by Zainer Izzat Zainal, who recently tried to write an article about major representations of Malaysian environmentalism in literary fiction for a book that I edited this past year, the Routledge Handbook of Ecocriticism and Environmental Communication. And she identifies several novels written in English that evoke a sense of environmental activism. So this is one of the efforts going on in a lot of parts of the world when you begin to introduce the idea of environmental literature and ecocriticism to them. They have to begin to look for a canon, for a number of texts that seem either accessible to the Western concept of ecocriticism or that represent local ideas in the field. Now, years ago, at a meeting in Beijing, a prominent Korean eco-critic, Wonjung Kim, challenged European and Eurocentric and particularly Anglophone, English-speaking scholars in the field by saying, why don't you cite us? Like we're constantly quoting you, referring to you, using your theories, but you don't know anything about what we're saying. And that hit me like a splash of cold water in the face and made me realize how Eurocentric and American-centric I was in my own work. And that helped to fuel my own zeal for gathering some of these perspectives from other parts of the world, rather than assuming that in North America and Europe we come up with all the good theories and then we just apply them everywhere else. Maybe there are some good ideas, imagine that, in other parts of the world. So he went on in his lecture to say, we cite America, but America doesn't cite us. In order to truly globalize eco-criticism, it's necessary to broaden its academic sphere to encompass literatures, and I would say scholarship as well, of non-English speaking countries. And then at the bottom of this passage, he writes, But American indifference or often simple inability to read and study literary works written in languages other than English has often been pointed out as a serious academic limitation. So I imagine many of you here are bilingual or multilingual. This is lectures happening under the auspices of an international center and a comparative literature program. And to the extent that you feel comfortable in languages other than English, you have a huge advantage in reaching out to those parts of the world to learn from them, not simply to carry our ideas from our culture, but to kind of open your ears and your minds to learn from these other cultures. So that's what I try to do in much of my own work. There are many different forms of ecocriticism in Latin America and other Spanish-speaking parts of the world. So I was present at a meeting in 2013 where colleagues from 6 Latin American countries tried to come up with a document to start their own branch of this international organization called ASLI for the study of literature and environment. And they came up with an initial draft of this plan for a pan-Latin American organization, and then a few months later I heard that it had collapsed, broken apart. They couldn't work very well with each other because Latin America is so diverse. Those of you who've spent any time there realize there's a huge difference in culture, sensibility, even language between some of the more equatorial parts of the continent and the southern countries of the continent. And particularly, I think there was some tension in working style between the Brazilians and the Argentines. So they were there together. They're sitting at the table together, and I actually had pictures of them kind of writing with left hand and right hand this document together, like they were forging some special kind of rapprochement between the cultures, and it didn't last very long. And Zélia Bora from Brazil, who's one of the most energetic scholars and ecocritics in that part of the world, eventually peeled away and started ASLI Brazil in August 2016. So they're now organizing meetings, and they, in a second I'll show them a picture of their new journal. But there continue to be people active in ecocriticism in places like Argentina and Chile. And in fact, Andrea Casals from Santiago published a special cluster of articles in this journal that I've edited for years, a few years ago, on Chilean ecocriticism that some of you might be interested in. I don't really have time to dwell on the specific traits of Chilean ecocriticism. A lot of it has to do with indigenous perspectives and representing indigenous perspectives, which is one of these similar songs that we hear in many parts of the world. Also, I should say that some of our colleagues here from Brigham Young University and many others around the United States are working in Latin American ecocriticism. And so a lot of the people doing the strongest work on Latin America happen to be here in the US at various American universities. When I was in Argentina a few years ago, it was with Roberto Forns-Broggi from Metropolitan State in Denver. He's Peruvian, and much of his scholarship concerns particularly poetry, but also fiction from Peru. And he's interested in cosmopolitan communication, the strange mixing of the local and the international. That's what he's written about in this recent article for the Routledge Handbook, Intercultural Communication as Cosmopolitan Communication. This is the new journal from ASLI Brazil. They're on number 3, issue number 3 of the journal. And their Brazilian ecocriticism especially is concerned with Amazonia, another literally hotspot, a place of great ecological concern. But there's also interesting literature and other forms of cultural exploration of Amazonia, like films. And there were some interesting films presented at a conference in the Amazon that many of us were at a few years ago. Also animal rights. Zélia Bora is particularly engaged with animal justice issues in João Pessoa in the far northeastern part of Brazil, and in questions of multiculturalism. Spanish ecocriticism is also a vibrant field in Spain, as you might expect. There's an organization called YECO, primarily based at the University of Alcalá near Madrid. where the leader is Carmen Fliss Junquera. And they've been going for well over a decade. They, in fact, publish the journal for the European Association for the Study of Literature, Culture, and Environment called Ecozona. And they've published a number of books in this field. I became aware of the Cuban tradition. George Handley is an expert on Cuba, far more than I am, but I joined a group of American environmental writers and scholars visiting Havana in December 2016. And this is the meeting room where we met at a foundation in Havana. This was the week after the mourning period for Fidel Castro had ended. And all around the room were pictures of Fidel playing golf, speaking into megaphones, meeting with his generals. And that was the room where we gave our lectures, where Fidel was a kind of haunting presence. And also all these artifacts were in these cases where we were sitting there as we were trying to pay attention to each other's talks. But what I came to learn is that Cuba, which has been relatively isolated from most of us in the United States for half a century, has a deep tradition of environmental thinking. People live very close to the land and have inherited many of their ideas about the natural world from other parts of the planet from which people have migrated, like Nigeria. So in a book that came out of our meeting in 2016, it was just published a few months ago, An Island in the Stream, Ecocritical and Literary Responses to Cuban Environmental Culture. Some of the interesting articles include one focusing on Yoruba African religion, which has been syncretically merged with Hispanic ideas in Cuban culture, ideas about animals and other aspects of nature. And then Cristina Maria Garcia, who's a young Cuban-American writer, teaches at the University of Charleston in South Carolina now. She writes about public sculpture in Havana and some fiction describing the ruins, the ruins of Havana. Okay, I need to speed up through the remaining part of this. But interesting work happening in this field, in that part of the world. China, nature is the most beautiful. China has one of the heaviest environmental footprints in the world, and yet China also thinks of itself as an environmental society. In fact, in 2005, the Chinese regime started something that they call the Ecological Civilization Program. And they now emphasize in many different facets of society, from economic and industrial dimensions to cultural dimensions, thinking green. And nature is the most beautiful is an idea, I'm having trouble advancing slides, that goes back to classical Chinese philosophy. This is a leading scholar I spent time with last summer, Lu Shuyuan, one of the most prolific Chinese ecocritics. I'm not going to dwell on any of the details. One of his books came out recently in English called The Ecological Era and Classical Chinese Naturalism, published by Springer in 2017. And in this, he focuses on Tao Yuan Ming, who lived from 365 to 427 AD, as an antecedent, as an early example of Chinese eco-philosophy, who bears a lot in common with Western thinkers like Henry David Thoreau and many others, British Romantic poets. And so this entire book attempts to connect Tao Yuan Ming with Western environmental thought, basically to suggest that all of us will benefit if we can rekindle our awareness of our environmental roots. So today in China, if you know phrases like these, I don't know a lot of Chinese. I can order a taxi and I can order foods and try to get myself out of trouble or into trouble in various other ways with my limited Mandarin. But if you know these phrases, people will have a sense that you're aware of the deep roots of Chinese environmental thinking. Tian Ren He means the harmonious oneness of the universe and man. And in China, they're very deeply concerned with harmony of various kinds, including harmony between the human and the non-human. And then tsuren dame, tsuren means nature in Chinese. Dame means the most beautiful. Nature is the most beautiful. This is a core idea in Taoist philosophy, and it means that if you follow the way of nature, it's likely to be the right way. And this comes from Zhuangzi, a famous Chinese philosopher. Now I'm just going to skip through most of the examples of Chinese ecocriticism, but a few summers ago I was in China with Terry Tempest Williams, local person from this area of the world, and her husband Brooke, meeting with her translator. Her most famous book is called Refuge, An Unnatural History of Family and Place, about growing up here in Utah. And Terry's Chinese translator is Cheng Hong, who is, she's been an eco-critic for many years and a translator of American environmental literature. As her husband worked his way up through the political ranks in China, her husband, Li Keqiang, is now the premier of China and the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party. He's the number 2 person in the Chinese government. His wife is a leading Chinese eco-critic, and the translator of local Utah environmental writer Terry Tempest Williams. So there, Terry's holding Cheng Hong's translation of her work, including some things that Terry writes about environmental activism and needing to push back against governments that are not supporting environmental causes. So it's fascinating to know that someone so high up in Chinese society would be translating a work like Refuge. I'm just going to skip through some of these examples and move on to India. So another kind of local variety is, this is an example of what I was saying earlier about respecting local cultures, local ideas, local philosophies, and realizing that we can learn something from them that we might be able to bring into our own lives or work in this part of the world. So the word tiNai is basically a kind of ecological system of thought in Southeast India, in the Tamil Nadu region, or where the Tamil culture and Tamil language exist. And Nirmal Selvamani here from Central University of Tamil Nadu is an expert in tiNai theory and applying classical Tamil philosophy of ecology and the need to know and to respect your local surroundings. He applies this to examples of Tamil literature and music. And here's one of his articles from years ago where he takes an ancient Tamil poem and then he interprets it in his article on the right here, analyzing various tiNai concepts as they apply to these ideas. Today in India, in addition to seeing people use classical philosophy, including Ayurvedic medicinal theories, you also see a lot of focus on issues of vulnerability and precarity and social injustice. And I think one of the leading eco-critics in the world is Professor Pramod Nayar from the University of Hyderabad, who's publishing a whole series of books related to precarity. This one came out in 2017 called Bhopal's Ecological Gothic: Disaster, Precarity, and the Biopolitical Uncanny, where in his introduction he says, precariousness is the effect of exposure to the world which then inflicts injury. Life requires a world that sustains life. This seems so obvious, and yet there are certain people who are on the front edge of vulnerability, victims of the Bhopal disaster from 1984, the Union Carbide chemical explosion that immediately killed hundreds of thousands of people and continues to have lingering health effects in India, and many other people who live impoverished lives and are at the front edges of various kinds of ecological precarity. But now even people who live modern, Western, educated, financially stable lives, like I think many of us, we are finding ourselves on the edge of precarity, needing to pay attention to this idea that life requires a world that sustains life. So the story of Bhopal is now becoming the story of Eastern Australia, which may in the future become the story that all of us inhabit no matter where in the world we happen to be living. So it behooves us, even if we're not interested in some of these far-flung areas of the world per se, to pay attention to some of their experiences and ideas, because they are relevant to us in certain ways, in addition to the intrinsic value of learning and caring about people who live elsewhere. Nayar also published a book earlier this year called Ecocritica, Vulnerable Lives in Literature and Culture. And he's particularly focusing on South Asian examples, but again, this idea of ecocritica, I think, may be related to what many of us experience, regardless of where we live. My colleague Swarnalata Rangarajan published this book, Overview of Ecocriticism, a couple years ago, that I think is a very good introduction. It's meant as an introduction. She particularly focuses on wetlands and swamps in her primary example at the end of the book, and suggests that from wetland ecology and a kind of a lens on the world that we learn by paying attention to wetlands, we can come to appreciate our biological embeddedness on the planet. There's also work happening in Bangladesh and Pakistan. I've spent some time there recently, and that's why India is not giving me a visa to go back right now. I've been blocked from going there in the past year because I've been too recently in some of these other countries that they consider sensitive regions. One of the reasons I didn't get a visa was that I was trying to go to Kashmir, where they were having a conference on environmental humanities, and they'd actually bought my plane ticket already, and then the Indian government learned that I had been in Pakistan and Bangladesh and refused to give me a visa for being potentially subversive. So I didn't make it to India again recently. I haven't spoken at all about Europe, where there's a huge amount happening in different parts of Europe, such as the empirical ecocriticism in Poland and the econarratology in Finland. And I really don't have any time to talk about Morocco at all, because I'm essentially out of time. But when I was there a couple summers ago, I was especially interested to see people taking classical Arabic and Islamic texts, such as the one on the screen here, and interpreting the Quran and other such texts in ecological ways. And that seemed to me the most interesting vernacular dimension of some of the work in Morocco. Nowadays, you might ask, why are you doing all this travel if you're concerned about climate change? I do actually give a number of my lectures. In fact, if the weather hadn't cooperated yesterday, I might have been Skyping you today. But a number of my talks nowadays are done through Skype, such as this lecture from last year to a group of students in India. But when you do that, it's hard to capture the spice of other cultures, to listen to them and learn about the special things happening in those parts of the world, which I so love to do. So this is my last slide. You may be getting the sense that I'll go almost anywhere to learn about ecocriticism and related ideas. I'll even crawl under boulders if someone tells me there are petroglyphs under there that might be worth looking at. My mother says she hates looking at this picture. It's kind of like a Wizard of the Oz picture, isn't it, with the witch from under the house? These are my legs from under a rock where I'm inspecting ancient Spanish petroglyphs. So I realize that many of you have to leave. I thank you for your attention, and I'm not leaving immediately, so if some of you want to linger and ask me some questions, you're welcome to do so. Thank you very much.
Indeed, we know some of you will have to run to class. If you do, please exit quietly. Those who want to stay and ask questions, we ask you to come to the microphone here so that we can hear your question. Please tell us who you are, what you're studying, and ask your question once sort of settle down here. So, thank you.
Hi, I'm James Nash. I saw that there was one slide that mentioned a little bit on Japan and with its heavy heritage through Shintoism and how they have to live side by side with nature. How much is there in the literary or scholarly field with ecocriticism in Japan? Because I feel like that would be a huge part of their culture.
Yeah, that's a great point. The scholars that I work have not really focused on Shintoism per se. In fact, many of them are more interested in anime and like modern Japanese culture, some of which evokes earlier cultural ideas from Japan. The funny thing about the development of Japanese ecocriticism, which, as I said in the previous slide here, which I didn't mention at all in my actual talk, Japan began to attach itself to Western ecocriticism relatively early, nearly 30 years ago. And many of the people who began this modern movement of Japanese ecocriticism were scholars of British and American culture. And they really were attached to Western texts, and they wanted to apply Western ideas to those texts. It was a bit later that this other professor, Ken Noda, who is an Americanist by training, decided that there were some things intrinsically in Japanese culture that deserved more attention. So Noda focuses on kind of modern Japanese texts in visual culture. One of his students actually came to the University of Nevada and was my first PhD student there from Japan, Yuki Masami. She specializes in women's writing and food culture, material culture, and writes a lot about Japanese philosophical ideas of place, like satoyama. Satoyama is something a little bit like tiNai. It means deeply knowing the place and applying your familiarity with place to other practical aspects of your life. She applies that to Japanese food culture. So there are people doing this work. There are some recent books on East Asian ecocriticism. I didn't include slides of those, but there is a flourishing, I would say, of ecocritical work in Japan, much of it in Japanese language and published in their own journal. I've been publishing or editing the journal Isle, for 25 years now. But shortly after I started editing this, they started their own journal on literature and environment. And I can read the abstracts. I don't read Japanese, so I'm not familiar with all of the topics that they're working on. But I would be surprised if some of them are not exploring Shintoism. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, my name is Wyatt Johnson, and one of the things that called out to my attention was how much I could say, how would I say, you're well versed in the different cultures and all that. Would you say for here we should start looking at more outward than inward, kind of like taking it, like you said and mentioned that the other other authors have mentioned, where we take ideas from other people's cultures to like implement in environmentalism and protecting. What would you say about that?
Well, that's obviously I strongly believe that we enjoy and we benefit from paying attention to other cultures. Often these other cultures mirror us in certain ways. A lot of the ideas that I'm saying about India and Japan and other places could apply to indigenous cultures in North America, but often somehow they strike home with us in a stronger or a different way if we encounter them elsewhere in the world. So we become particularly receptive to things that are close to home when we find them reflected in distant cultures. That's one reason to be paying attention, so that we can learn about ourselves and our homes. I think it also is just an important sensibility to carry through life, to be open-minded, to be curious, to be respectful. And I think personally, I believe that all of us on the planet would benefit from these fundamental traits. And we often learn that by going abroad and not being one of the mainstream group with a few outsiders among us, but being a bit an outsider for a change. And I think many of you who've lived abroad will understand that it's actually a huge learning experience. Apart from any daily practical skills that you might learn by living abroad, simply the fact of being an outsider and then appreciating what it means to be respectful and attentive. And also kind of the survival skills that you get by going to a place and adapting quickly. I often talk about the language of traffic. In many parts of the world, simply crossing a street is utterly different than it would be here in Provo, Utah, or most parts of North America, like China. In China, there's a completely different etiquette, and it's a survival skill. Like, how do you weave among the cars and the bicycles, and when do you jaywalk and when do you not, and all of these things that seem trivial, but actually become life lessons that we carry with us. So I think it's great that BYU has so many students studying abroad, such a high rate of bilingualism and multilingualism. These are really great things. And if there were a way to encourage this at many other universities in the U.S., I think that would be very positive.
Awesome.
Thank
you
you.
very much.
Kiani Calendar, and I noticed that in your personal definition of ecocriticism that you shared with us, you mentioned that it could be applied not only to literature but also other cultural expressions. So I was wondering if you had at all researched ecocriticism in cultural music, and if so, what your experience was with that.
I'm just trying to get there quickly. Oops. I've only focused a little bit on music. I was writing something about scale and water a few years ago, and I was, my expertise is literature. I was actually trained in American and British literature before I became more of a comparative lit person. I was writing about Andy Goldsworthy's outside art, and then I found myself thinking about this transgender musician named Anthony Hegarty, who also goes by Anani, who does a lot of environmental music and has a song about the ocean and the changing of the ocean and with the implications of pollution and extinction of species in the ocean. And I realized that there's something that his song had a lot to do with affecting the way we experience not just spatial scale, but temporal scale, movement or change over time. I think the interesting thing about music is that it's not in one moment, but it's experienced consecutively or chronologically over time. And so when I wrote about that several years ago, I was especially interested in the temporal dimension of music. There are other scholars who emphasize acoustic ecology. They write about soundscapes, not just music per se, but ambient sound in daily life. For instance, the PhD student I mentioned earlier from Japan, Yuki Masami, her PhD dissertation was on sonic landscapes. Then there's also a guy named David Ingram from England who wrote a book called The Garden in the Jukebox. There's a famous book called The Machine in the Garden. Then there's a book called The Garden in the Machine about environmental film. He wrote a book on popular music, British and American popular music as it represents environmental ideas. So there are a number of people doing this through popular culture studies and acoustic ecology studies. There's also a book called, what's it called? It's on music and ecology, specifically, I forget his name. I don't know that book very well, but I know that a certain number of people are using these and many other cultural texts. But music is certainly receiving some attention.
Awesome. Thank
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Dallin Durchie. First off, thank you for the work you've done in the field of environmental stewardship and eco-criticism. So my question is this. I notice it's clear from your presentation there's been a lot of success in terms of scholarship and books written about eco-criticism in the past from all over the world. But sometimes I feel a problem that exists amongst academia and scholarship is that those writings exist in kind of a cycle of other academics. So my question is, how do you go about getting the mainstream public to become knowledgeable about eco-criticism and about environmental awareness? And what are some of the successes you've seen in the public becoming more knowledgeable about this topic?
That's the perfect question for us to end on. Thank you for that. One of my jobs from the role that I have in the field is to kind of monitor the progress of the field and write sort of historical summaries or analyses of the way the field is developing. We tend to call these waves or phases. And I just recently wrote about what I call the fifth wave of eco-criticism, which is a phase where eco-critics are going public. And so actually, I haven't had a chance to visit with my friend George Hanley lately, but George, are you on the city council here? I don't know whether your vision as an eco-critic or your experience as an eco-critic brings anything into your role as a public official.
Absolutely.
So that's one way, is when eco-critics kind of get out of their office chairs and go sit in other chairs in the city hall and in public meetings and interface and interact with other kinds of citizens whom we might not otherwise meet every day as we do our colleagues and students. But the fifth wave of eco-criticism is all about going public and finding ways to take ideas from our scholarly work and from our classrooms and write them up in different ways and publish them elsewhere, and including letters. You know, one of the things that I do when I started, quote unquote, going public with my work was writing letters to corporate officials. It was after one of my visits to India, in fact, when I met Vandana Shiva, the environmental justice activist, and started learning about the privatization of water, how rural water resources were becoming coming to be bought up by multinational corporations like Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola, and local villagers who didn't even really use the market economy no longer had access to their traditional water. And that worried me, and I got back home and started grading papers and doing my usual academic work. And then I thought, you know, this is nagging you. You should do something about it. So I began writing letters to the CEO of Coca-Cola. And he would pass them off to their PR people. But I developed a whole series of letters, exchanges with Coca-Cola about the privatization of water in India. So writing letters to a corporate official was getting out of my literary comfort zone. And more recently, I've been writing a lot of op-eds and pieces for newspapers, from the New York Times to local newspapers, and also created a website. Published a book in 2015 with my father, who's a psychologist at the University of Oregon. And then we thought, well, not everyone is going to read this book. Let's create a website and show how these ideas are relevant to current issues. And let's publish blogs in that website that are short and accessible, that apply to recent events related to humanitarian and ecological crises. And then let's try to invite our colleagues to also contribute to this blog on this website. So finding different ways of expressing ourselves is vital to, I think, the relevance of this field to the state of the world. And just as a final note, when I was teaching in China at Beijing Forestry University this past July, I invited a colleague of mine, you can see her in the corner over there, named Songli Li. She's a literature professor at Tsinghua University, one of the preeminent Chinese universities. It's China's MIT. But she said that years ago, she lost interest in writing these academic articles for a narrow audience of people who already know what she's going to say. And she started writing what she calls mini blogs, like short essays on Twitter. And she's published 320 of these in the past decade or so, often sharing new environmental ideas about NGOs that are operating in China with the Chinese public. So here she is giving a talk at the end of my class about her efforts as an eco-critic turned environmental activist in China, not a country that you would think would support this kind of work. And these are my students. I had 47, a huge group of interdisciplinary students at Beijing Forestry University. They're fascinated. They're totally excited about the fact that she's stepping out of her academic niche to do this work. You can see some of the students taking pictures of her information, like they want to read her blog, they want to learn how to do this themselves. So I think this is a new wave in the field where we're not just writing for the choir, but we're attempting to engage more deeply and meaningfully with the larger public.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you.